Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this Fleet Europe initiative with the support of ChargePoint. In a few weeks' time, 2021 is behind us. A challenging year for our fleet community with events like the pandemic, the chip shortage. But despite these events, we see that corporate fleets have kept their promise regarding sustainability and also fleet electrification. Now, whether your business is at the start of its transition to e-mobility or well on its way, you will be confronted with a growing demand for charging solutions. Charging solutions at home of your employees and at the office. And you will have to find the right balance as well in the charging infrastructure mix, taking into account elements like grid capacity and also the capability for your employees to charge seamlessly when needed. This is not always an easy exercise, but luckily it's not impossible. In today's webinar with Fleet Europe, one of the biggest and most innovative charging solutions specialists, ChargePoint, will guide us through the essential considerations for truly integrated and future-proof charging. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our expert speakers of today's webinar. Frederik Wagner, he is the Manager of Fleet Partnerships at ChargePoint, and André ten Bloemendaal, he is Vice President Commercial Sales Europe at ChargePoint. Gentlemen, welcome to this webinar. Welcome for supporting Fleet Europe. The topic, of course, it's really exciting. It's also a very actual topic for many fleets across Europe and even on an international basis. So I would say, let's kick off. I will hand over the floor to you. And at the end of your presentation, we will have a Q&A session. So to the audience, if you have questions for our expert speakers, then you can submit your question via the chat function in this tool. And at the end, we will moderate some of the most interesting questions submitted. André, Frederik, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and welcome to you all in these exciting times, as Stephen just said. Exciting in the landscape of charging, exciting in the end of this year. What a crazy year it has been once again. We thought it couldn't be crazier last year, and then this year it's at least as strange again. So I hope you're all safe. I hope you're all healthy. And with having said that, let's get into the presentation. I start with a short overview of what ChargePoint is. It may well be that not all of you are familiar with the company. So only in a few words, we are around now for 14 years. This says still 1,000 plus employees worldwide, which is absolutely true. But in the meantime, we have 1,500 plus. And that is due to natural growth or growth by just adding people to the departments that we already had, plus 2 acquisitions. So the 2 acquisitions that we did last year, this year actually, is Vericity. And Vericity is an Amsterdam-based company that focuses on EV charging solutions for bus and truck. That includes telematics, and it includes an holistic approach with optimizing also the routing, the driver behavior and what have you, to get the maximum out of the EV transition. And the other company that we acquired is Has2Be, based in Rastatt in Austria. And the Has2Be company provides additional capabilities to the ChargePoint services in terms of software. So we have become, over the past 14 years, a predominant software company, while we think that the whole charging infrastructure is vital, but operating the infrastructure provides the solution to really facilitate the EV transition that we have to facilitate in the coming years. So it's more a software solution-based focus than a hardware solution-based focus. And actually, we are in the meantime completely hardware agnostic. Although we bring our own hardware for specific use cases, to optimize the driver experience and the capability to scale. has a platform called Be Energized, which allows service providers also to build their own solutions for the market, again, to further facilitate and accelerate the EV transition in this market. We have more than 200,000 ports available through roaming. We have more than 150,000 ports active on our backend. And we went public early February this year, and you can find us on the New York Stock Exchange under the ticker symbol CHPT. Further offices, of course, around Campbell, Silicon Valley in the US, where we all started. A production facility in Guadalajara. We have ample people in the meantime in China and in India. India particularly also on the engineering part. The engineering office for Europe sits in Reading, and we are present also in Germany. Next. So if you look at the questions that we are facing in a day-to-day environment when looking at EV charging transition or EV transition, is questions around where should we charge? And I will show in a minute, why that is a relevant question. And the next question then pops up immediately, which is who can then charge where and how do I control that? And how do I control that has also a relationship with the TCO. One of the things that we are daily in contact with is fleet managers that are concerned about one thing, which is how do I control and manage my TCO? If I look at the charging pricing, the kilowatt hour pricing of people charging at the home, at houses, that's somewhere around 25 cents per kilowatt hour. If I then look at fast charge networks, it can easily be 75 cents per kilowatt hour. And how do I control that access? How do I control that TCO? It's a very important question. So in order to be able to do that, you need an integrated charging ecosystem, and we will explain what that means and how that will help you in that transition, focusing on cost and expansion. And what we, of course, all need to do is to bring a reliable and seamless driver experience. What we need with that is the driver should be the focal point and should have an easy job finding stations, getting access to stations, starting and stopping sessions, but also being in control again of the cost and of their behavior. Next, please. So around that, where can I charge and where should I charge and how does this evolve? In this EV transition, there is a very important difference going on compared to what we were used to. We were used to what is crossed out here in red, which is that we were driving around, whether it were service delivery fleets, private vehicles, passenger cars, or whatever. We were driving around basically till the yellow LED indicator in the dashboard gave the signal that we had to go to a gas station and fuel up again. Everybody had that behavior, and if you were very, very conscious of cost, you drove around a little bit to get the cheapest price per liter. But in general, you have to go somewhere, get gas in your tank, and then continue to drive. That completely changes. What happens now is that the whole charging is based around dwell time. When you park your car, you have the ability to charge. And that is exactly what is happening. And the reason for that is, again, tying back into the TCO. If you want to control cost, the cheapest available kilowatt hours are at your house and at the workplace. So that's generally where cars are parked also the longest. So guess what? That's where you want to charge your car because it's most convenient. The car is parked there anyway, and it's most cost efficient. The kilowatt hours are the cheapest. And of course, if you drive longer distances, if you go on a holiday, if you have a delivery fleet that really does long mileage, then of course you want to be able to charge in public along the road, the highways, etc. And of course, you want to charge really fast then, but that will be only 20-ish% of all the charging taking place, and around the 80%, and that's the same in basically every country, is currently already taking place at home or at the workplace, again, for the reasons that I just gave. So that whole landscape is changing, and therefore it's so important to have an integrated ecosystem that includes charging at home, charging at the workplace, and charging in public, in order to be able to provide that seamless driver experience and control your cost. Next, please. And then this is maybe the most vital one that we see over the past year. This is all about scalability. Over the past years, the past 8 years that I've been in this industry, we've always been looking at the left-hand side of this chart. And the left-hand side says, I start charging. There is 3 vehicles where we really try to understand how difficult or easy it is. It may be the Tesla for the senior staff. It may well be the first 3 cars in the delivery fleet. It may well be the first 3 cars in the service fleet that are take-home cars as well. There is all of these use cases, but they're all small. You all started small, and we all said already for 8 years in a row, I've been there and said it myself many, many times, and next year it will really take off. And next year we will have the cars available and the availability to choose from a widespread of vehicles that I really like and that I can choose from. Next year, once again. And this year, actually, for the first time, is the next year. You see the number of vehicles, you see the take-up rate, you see all of the legislation picking up, you see the grants picking up. And the growth in the market this year is phenomenal. And automatically you go from the left-hand side into the middle segment. And all of a sudden, we are not talking anymore about the first 2 or the first 3 or the first 5, whereby probably you look at convenience, and certainly you have been looking at cost. As long as these things are cheap, nothing can go wrong. But there were little or nobody who told you that in the middle, you were scaling up to a level already that you got into grid connection or grid extension discussions. You got into availability of charge stations discussions. So you wanted to introduce wait list and other things to get your utilization up. All of a sudden, you get into this mixed use case whereby you want some people that can do it to charge at home and some people to charge at the office and some in a blended situation. You want some people to have access to public charging and some not, because you want to control cost. And then in the third instance, and that's in the coming years, you will have the next step with integration of solar, with integration of other sources of energy, with storage of energy, with new standards coming around the block, like ISO 15118. So there is a lot that will go on and is already going on. And all of these near future, this is not years out, this is next year and the coming 3 years. These future developments have already an enormous impact on the decisions you can make today. And what we try to do is to help you understand what will be important to realize already today and bake in your solution that you choose for in order to be able to scale whatever the scale curve will be for you individually in the near future. So having that said, on the next slide, I give over to Frederick, who will guide you through the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Andre, and welcome to everyone in the webinar also from my side. Before we dive into the key considerations in a little bit more detail, I'd like to quickly define what are fleets, and in the EV space, what are the considerations that pertaining to those fleets that you need to have in mind. So if you look at the top of this slide, you'll see the 4 different types of fleets that you'll generally come into contact with. As a fleet manager, you'll have company cars, for example, your employees that travel. You'll have private vehicles. So let's say customers that are visiting your office locations or clients that are visiting to stop in and need a charge. You also have motor pools. So for example, return to base company cars that are shared amongst employees. And on the right, you have service and delivery vehicles. So these are vans. And if you look on the left side of the image, you'll see the different charging aspects that are relevant. So you have different charging locations. So whether it be at home or at the office, in the depot, or on the road. There's also different charging speeds. So things get a little bit more complex with the e-mobility system because you have, as many of you have heard of, AC charging, which is generally a little bit slower. And you have DC, rapid or fast charging, which you see on highways that can fill up a vehicle very quickly. And since we're in a commercial setting, it's important to consider the billing aspects of those fleets. So just to quickly dive through what's relevant for each of these, if you look at the company cars, these are your employees that currently have a fuel card. So they're used to filling up their cars easily and conveniently. Having said that, you need to make sure that as a fleet manager, you can provide those employees convenient access to charging their vehicles wherever they park. As Andre said, at home, at office most of the time, but also occasionally on the road as they are traveling beyond their battery's range. You'll need generally normal AC charging in the home and office settings, but occasionally fast charging. But it's important, especially on the billing management side, to make sure that you're reimbursing those drivers automatically, and then they're not having to pay for it in advance for those charging sessions. It needs to be like the fuel card environment. Looking to the next section, the private vehicles, this is generally simpler compared to the other settings because it's about providing your customers, your clients, your employees who don't have a company car, convenient access to charging at the workplace. This is generally normal charging speed, an AC charging station at your office, and it's important to think there that it might just be one station today, but those vehicles that are going to be visiting or going to be parking at your office locations will continually to become electric, so think about scalability there. As you look to motor pool and vans on the right of this image, the requirements are quite similar. You'll see that depot charging is a topic, and depot means that the vehicles return to one common base. So they do their route and they return to that location. Occasionally, if you're traveling very far distances, if it's a service or delivery fleet, you might need to provide public charging, but that's generally optional. The important thing to look at here is what is the best fit of charging speed for the time that those vehicles are parked. So if you have overnight charging, let's say 8 hours from the evening until the morning when you charge, normal charging is definitely sufficient. But if you operate a delivery service, a grocery delivery service with very quick turnaround times, where your vehicles are only parked for 30 to 60 minutes while they're being loaded, that's maybe a setting where rapid charging is best. And as mentioned, the billing topic there would be access to public charging if necessary, but generally it's in a closed loop. So if we could go to the next slide, I'd like to talk through these key considerations and how those are important to you as a fleet manager. First and foremost, as Andre said, it's about total cost of ownership. We're all gauged by our ability to manage an efficient ecosystem, and the same is true for the charging world and the world of electric vehicles. The second piece is about an integrated charging ecosystem. Things are growing and becoming a little bit complex as we go along this EV journey. It's important to have a partner or to have people by your side that can take that complexity out of it, and that's done by having one common solution. And last, but definitely not least, is about the drivers. You as a fleet manager, one could say that your customers are your drivers. Your internal fleet drivers need to be happy. They need to be equipped with a very convenient way to charge their vehicles. Otherwise, you'll be getting complaints. You'll be having to deal with suppliers. So it's important to have a driver experience that is convenient, intuitive, and can scale as your fleet becomes more electric. So let's jump to the next slide and start with total cost of ownership. There are two components that are important when it comes to electric fleet vehicle total cost of ownership. The first are the vehicles themselves. And when I talk about the vehicles, I'm talking about the charging usage of those vehicles. So you need to have a dashboard or a solution set, a source of data that provides you complete transparency on the number of drivers you have, how your fleet is electrifying, but most importantly, what the cost and the usage of that charging is. Is it predominantly in public? Is it predominantly at home? Is it taking place at work? And by having that transparency, you can efficiently motivate and incentivize charging to take place in the right places. And you can map the total cost of ownership specifically on a vehicle level to know that you're getting the best value for your money. What changes with electric vehicles is not only how the vehicles charge, but where the vehicles charge. And one of the biggest changes there is the ability to charge your electric vehicle at home. And as we look into managing fleets, having integrated home charging is absolutely crucial. So it's important to make sure that that home charging aspect is completely integrated into the rest of the fleet vehicle management system. So you want to be able to see how many home installations are taking place, how much charging is taking place at these homes, and how many vehicles have a respective home charging installation. That way, you can do interesting comparisons and make business decisions, which is what data is there for, to say, what's the total cost of ownership of an electric vehicle with a home charging solution versus an electric vehicle in my fleet that doesn't have a home charging solution? If we go to the next slide, we'll talk about the second part of the total cost of ownership calculation. First part was the vehicle. The second part is the infrastructure. As we all know, moving to electric vehicles can also mean an investment in charging stations. This could be at the workplace, at the depot, at the factory. Depending on your business, it can vary quite a bit. The most important thing to consider here is smart charging. And smart charging means charging stations that aren't just hardware, but they are connected to an intelligent, software-based backend. What does that do for you? A number of things. It gives you insights to the data. It lets you know which vehicle is charging when, how much kilowatt hours, etc. It allows you to control access, who can charge where. Perhaps during the day, only internal fleet vehicles can charge at a charging station, but in the evening, you open it up to other employees or even the public. It's important to have that flexibility, and you can only do that if there's an intelligent system behind it. You can determine pricing, and you get the reporting to make decisions about, do I need to increase utilization, or do I need to incentivize a different behavior at the workplace to make sure more people get a charge? But what's really important for you as the fleet manager is the ability to handle energy requirements. So if you look on the right side of this image, you see a graphic. And let me explain to you what you're seeing there. On the x-axis, you're seeing the time of day. And on the y-axis, you're seeing the amount of energy consumed. The orange bars represent the consumption of that building. So let's say that's an office building. And you can see it peaks at certain times, but it's generally quite stable. And then if you look at the blue bars, those represent the additional load that comes on top when vehicles are charging. So you see in this case, it looks like it's maybe a service or a delivery fleet where the vehicles are coming back to the office at about 7:30, 8 p.m. And then there's a big peak of charging consumption. And then once the vehicles are fully charged, it kind of drops off. The problem here is that to service that peak that goes up to, in this image, you see almost 7,500 kilowatt, you have a big demand charge from your utility because they have to ensure that you can consume that electricity and that they provide it to you. If you have a smart charging solution behind that, you can make sure that your charging solution never consumes more than your max demand, which you can level at 3,000 kilowatt, for example, in this case. And that way you can ensure that all of your vehicles are charged by the next morning, let's say 8 a.m. when they have to return to their routes, and you never exceed that peak. So by choosing the right software to accompany your charging solution, you can optimize the total cost of ownership of the infrastructure. Last but not least, consider uptime. If you're operating a fleet that has really high SLAs, so you can't afford for a charging station to be down for 30 minutes, then you need to make sure that you have the solution set, the partners, and the maintenance program behind that to support that. It depends what your business is, but of course, you need to make sure there's a perfect match there so that your mission critical vehicles are on the road. So let's go to the next slide. And here I'd like to talk about the integrated ecosystem. Andre mentioned at the beginning, you transition from maybe just needing hardware to an entire ecosystem where you're managing workplace, home, public charging, you're managing different groups of drivers, different types of vehicles. Things need to be integrated to work as a system. And what you see on this image in front of you is a rough depiction of the value chain in EV charging. So let's start at the top left corner where the energy is produced. So you'll have a utility that produces the energy, and that energy is then transitioned through the grid to the site host. So this could be your company that owns hardware, charging stations. Those charging stations are managed by software, and those charging stations are accessed by an EMSP service. So that's, for example, the RFID card or the app you use to start the charging session there. The energy from that charging session goes into a vehicle, so an OEM's battery, and that whole process is then managed and accessed by a driver. So you can see that there's a lot of moving parts here. And especially in an industry that is growing very quickly, it's important to have a cohesive solution here. So based on our experience, the more you can cover on this value chain, the better the driver experience can be, because it's not fragmented. You're not telling your fleet vehicles, for public charging, go to this service. For home charging, go to this service. If you have a problem with the hardware at the office, call this company. It needs to be cohesive and it needs to be understandable so that you're not dealing with support cases all day, and that you can also scale the system. So if you have this solid backbone of a solution that can provide you an ecosystem, you can then scale from that first stage with maybe a few chargers to the middle stage where you start offering charging at all locations, to the far right stage where your fleet is predominantly electric vehicles and it's a functioning ecosystem. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk about driver experience. As I said, you as a fleet manager, in many cases, your customers are your internal fleet users. So you need to make sure that they're happy. And based on my experience, it starts with simple things like giving them one charging card that they can use to access charging stations everywhere. So whether it be charging in public, if they're traveling a long distance, whether it be charging at home or charging at work, it needs to be convenient and non-complicated. It's also important to provide those drivers reliable information. If you're driving in your vehicle on the highway, you want to be able to see if the charging station that you're targeting is occupied, if it's available, maybe it's being serviced, so it's not available because there's maintenance going on. You need to make sure that there's reliable information, and that's only possible if it's coming from smart, connected charging stations. As I mentioned, seamless, easy charging experience, and this is about you, the fleet manager. You're going to get questions about how much are these electric vehicles costing us? How much are they charging at home? How's public charging usage? Do we need to optimize any of those areas? What about the investment that we made for the workplace charging stations? Are they being used? You don't want to have to go to 15 different data sources to answer those questions. Ideally, it's all in one consolidated platform so that you can answer questions and make decisions that are going to optimize the cost of operating your fleet. Support. And of course, we all hope that nothing goes wrong, but as we know, that's not always the case. For your drivers on the road and your fleet vehicles on the road, 24/7 support is the bare minimum, especially when we're talking about mission critical vehicles. If you have a driver who's stranded on the highway that needs to get a charge and has a question, he needs or she needs to be able to access support right away. The same is true for your charging infrastructure. You need to have technical support, the partnerships with electricians, with operations and maintenance providers, close to your office locations, your depot locations, so that if something does go wrong, that your mission critical infrastructure can stay operational. You need reliable reimbursement. And this goes back to the commercial considerations talking about billing management. If you're providing charging for a fleet of company vehicles, today those drivers are used to swiping their fuel card or their company credit card. The experience doesn't need to be any different with electric vehicles. So reliable reimbursement, whether it be at home or public, is key to success. And last, it's important to take care of driver security, of security of driver data. So when we look into the status quo with fueling a diesel or a petrol vehicle, there's not really personal information coming into contact. It's not done via apps. And this changes a little bit when it comes to electric vehicle charging. Customers are using apps to access charging infrastructure. So it's important that all of that data is handled in a completely protected GDPR compliant manner. And this is important to anyone that you're providing a charging solution to, whether it be your internal fleet drivers, your external customers charging your locations. You want to be able to convey absolute confidence that no matter where they're charging or who has access to the data, that it's completely secure and in compliance with the local regulations. So if we go to the next slide, I'd like to just quickly give some ideas as how you can get started. There's a lot to think about, as you've seen over the past slides, those key considerations, thinking about the total cost of ownership of the vehicle, thinking about the total cost of ownership of the infrastructure, creating an integrated ecosystem, and ensuring that your customers, the drivers, are happy. So what we've seen be very successful is starting with a pilot program. So start with that image on the left where it's just a couple stations. If you look at your fleet, let's say you have 10 service and delivery vans, maybe you want to start by electrifying 2 of them. Do it in a controlled way with a clear plan of growth. And there are experts that can help you going from low electrification of your fleet all the way to complete electrification. And that way you can always stop and make regular checks. Are we doing this most efficient way? Was having the AC or the DC charging solution the right decision? So make sure that you do it with a pilot approach, but in a scalable way. Audit your needs and plan for the future. We all know that this is really just taking off now. This is the time the vehicles are coming into the market. Customers are excited. They have choice, whether it be a small private vehicle or large electric buses. The market is there. The vehicles are there. So let's look at the use cases. Let's have the experts look at your specific location and match charging needs with parking times, with dwell times, and create an optimal solution for your charging requirements. And last but not least, ask for support. Companies like ChargePoint are more than happy to visit your locations and give you an expert recommendation on how we would expand your charging infrastructure. So I'd like to thank you. That's the end of the presentation. Appreciate your attention. I'll hand back to Stephen, who'll enter the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Frederick. Thank you for the great insights. Ladies and gentlemen, as mentioned, we start now with the Q&A. Should you have a question for our expert speakers, then please submit your question via the chat. We will start right now. First question is a personal one, and I'm going to ask it to Andre. Andre, you mentioned in your first slides, you mentioned something about the dwell time, and there you said, well, roughly speaking, you should consider that 80% of charging should take place at home or at the office to be as cost efficient as possible. I have to change company car. I don't have the opportunity to charge at home. I would love to have a full electric vehicle, a battery electric vehicle. From a cost perspective, charging perspective, do you then say that this is not the most wise choice to make?
No, I wouldn't say that. On the contrary, I would almost say. So it depends a little bit on where you can charge. So let's let's take the most extreme. If you can't charge at home and you would only be able to charge at a fast charge station, still then, with the 70, let's say it's 75 cents per kilowatt hour, and you do 5 kilometers to the kilowatt hour, you are at, let's say 15 cents per kilometer that you would cost. And with the 223 that I have seen at the gas stations for normal petrol nowadays, if you do 1 on 10, 1 on 14, you're higher than that still.
Mhm.
So even if you would only charge at fast, which nobody does, right? It is again, nothing against fast charge stations. They are really good, and they are absolutely necessary to be able to do long mileage. But if you can do it in normal public situations, you pay 30, 32, 35 cents. You are well below the normal cost of petrol. The price of a car gets very, very close to the price of a petrol car, if not lower, even in many countries. Plus, the fun of driving an EV is it's so much better to drive an EV than a petrol car. That there is absolutely, literally nothing that should withhold you to make that transition.
Okay, a few questions pop in. The first one, I'm going to try to see if I understand it correctly. From Rodney Sesniak. Hi, are the car share fleets included on the ChargePoint roadmap? So I think what he means is, if, for example, there is like a carpooling place or a car share place where they have an installation, is that also included on your system?
Yes, if I may take that, Fred. Yeah, the answer to that is yes. And the interesting thing here, and it's, we can easily fill the next 23 minutes answering this question, but the very interesting thing that you raise here, Rodney, and thank you for that, is the question around who is the denominator for the charge session cost. And what I mean with that is, if it's a driver, you want the driver to pay. If it's an employee, you want the employer to pay on behalf of the employee. If it is a car and you pay for the use of the car because it's a shared car, it should be the car that is picking up the bill of the charge, which then is going to be forwarded to the sharing company, and you pay per kilometer. So you pay in a totally different way, and you should not be able to pick up that charge, or should be needed to pick up the charge and then get it reimbursed or whatever. But actually the payment should be done with that car, and the car should be the denominator. That's exactly what we do. So indeed, we have two separate solutions whereby we say either it's the driver that we need to identify, and that driver can actually even swap cars. So that's the different approach to that, or it's the car, and the car can actually have different drivers. Both are possible.
Okay. Then a question from Yeet Bannerier, if I pronounce it correctly. What is the most suitable charging power for charge at work? And what is the EV to charge point ratio that should be considered?
I'm happy to take that, Andre, if that's fine with you. I think it depends is the classic answer there, and it generally depends on the type of vehicles that you're charging. If I had to say, a general trend is about is 22 kilowatt AC charging. That covers most use cases, because if you're looking at a normal company car, so let's say private vehicles, you can charge about 2 of those per day with a 22 kilowatt AC charging station. If you look at fleets, so let's say service and delivery fleets that are charged overnight, there are some settings where a 7 kilowatt charging station, also depending on the market, could be sufficient. But it's really about looking at how big is the battery that I'm trying to charge, and how powerful is the charging station that it's going to be using. and then looking also at the energy requirements and creating an optimized picture out of that. So take those aspects into consideration and talk to a company like ChargePoint that can kind of guide you through that planning process, and you'll get the optimum charger for your workplace.
Another question from Sebastiano Foglia. Is there any risk that the fast charging damages somehow the battery and reduces the residual life of the vehicle?
That's a very interesting one again. The truth of the matter is, if you have a good car company, the car company has established the battery management system in such a way that that is impossible. So the batteries are made to withstand the charging power that the car can actually accept. And that's why you see many cars, accepting 200 kilowatt, others only 100 or 80, and only a very, very few 300 or 325, 350, where you get to the physical maximum with cooled cables. So the manufacturer should have taken care that that is not a problem. The problem of damaging a battery is much more around whether you decharge the battery too far or charge the battery too far. In other words, the actual battery operational bandwidth is between 20% and 80%. And normally you will only by exception be allowed to charge to 100% of the battery. And you will see that, in the early Teslas, that was one of the settings that you had to do at the start. For those who drove one of those, whereby you could actually set the 80% to a higher level. And then every time when you get in the car, it warns you, please take care because you're damaging the battery potentially. And warranty may be exposed, etc., etc. So it's much more in the bandwidth than it's in the power. The power should be in line with what the battery is made for.
Okay, and if I understand you correctly, Andre, that bandwidth is automatically set by the car manufacturer. So it's
Correct.
not that you as a driver, you need to set the 20 and the 80%.
Nope.
That is done automatically.
You can overrule in certain circumstances. Some cars, most cars, I think nowadays will let you overrule it temporarily or so many times. So if you really know that you have to go further, it allows you to overcharge to the 100%. But the standard setting is 2080, correct.
Okay. A question from Mats Johansson. What brands of charging posts can you connect to your platform?
It's a good question. Apart from basically 2, we can do all. And the 2 is not up to us. It always takes 2 to tango, as they say. Mm-hmm. So you need companies that are willing to offboard, as we say it in technical terms, their stations, so allow another back office to go on those stations. And apart from 2 European companies, every company is willing to do that and facilitate that nowadays. In total, we do 604 station types as we speak.
Okay, good. Question from Christina Gavrila. ChargePoint can also offer software solution for charging stations. Would this software solution then also work on stations which are sourced from another provider?
Fred?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Christina, and thank you for asking that. I think it's important to look at which software solution you're looking at. So if you're trying to provide a simple workplace charging environment, then generally you can use a software solution from ChargePoint to connect those third-party stations, as Andre said, to our platform, and those can be operated actually with full functionality without any problem. I think if you're looking at more complex settings, so let's consider a very demanding depot charging environment where you're managing energy on a 15-minute interval and optimizing route planning into that calculation as well. then you'll have to look at the limitations of having disparate systems working together. It might be better to have one solution that's fully integrated in that sense. I think if you consider the use case and consider what the ChargePoint platform can provide there, the answer is definitely yes. We can provide that solution to work on other stations. Andre, is there anything you want to add on that as far as perhaps the has to be way that can enable other service providers?
No, it is as you said, and maybe the only thing to add is that you have to be slightly careful. So there is a disclaimer here in general, which is the language that the stations speak. And the downward or upward compatibility of those stations, which is generally true, but something to take into consideration. So the coming year, hey, there we are again, next year, but literally next year, you will see stations to be introduced on OCPP 2.0, and the stations that are introduced on OCPP 2.0 can do different things than stations on 1.6, which is something to normally to consider, but there is no backward compatibility. So you see many stations that are on 1.6 at this moment who cannot be upgraded, will not be upgradable to 2.0. So in that particular case, the software probably can do it, but then the hardware may be lagging behind. So you should be careful always. And then I get back to my slide 3 or so, with this future ability to scale. That's one of those things that we will always bring to the table. Where do you want to go? What kind of stuff do you need to be backward compatible with in the future? We can help you to understand which big blocks that are. And if then one of those big blocks is valid for you, we will advise you to go for certain hardware in order to have that backward compatibility going forward.
Good. A question again from Yet Ballerier. What is the general life cycle of the end-to-end solutions? And in case of CAPEX, what is the operating years to be considered?
Well, on the CAPEX, in general, accountants state 7 years. So the amortization period of 7 years is the general go-to type of amortization period. What is the general life cycle of the end-to-end solution? We assume at this moment over 15 years. While we are 14 years old, there is no way in practice you can prove. So it's all on models and testing. We do a hell of a lot of testing in our own testing labs, and we have reason to believe that it's well over 15 years. So that would be something that I would consider 15 years as a normal go-to point, whereby, and then you get back to interesting stats again. If you look at the things that break are cables, if you have a cable station, or the sockets earlier than anything else. So it's then good to have stations that are serviceable. And also there is a massive difference between manufacturers that really have designed their stations to be maintainable, or those who have designed the stations to be not maintainable and therefore to be ripped and replaced. It won't come as a surprise, me bringing it up, that our stations are fully maintainable.
Okay. And then she added, do you also have OpEx options available?
Fred?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's as a fleet manager looking at total cost of ownership, it's a question that we would expect and that we get quite often. And the answer is yes. So there's generally 3 types of scenarios when it comes to optimizing the perfect blend between CapEx and OpEx. The first is outright purchase of the charging infrastructure, which is obviously full CapEx up front, and then you have some ongoing OpEx for the software and the SLA surrounding that. The second option would be to finance that, and companies like ChargePoint have very strong partners in the finance community that can help you if you're planning a large deployment to finance that in a way that fits your needs. And the final offer, the final option is what we call ChargePoint as a service, which is essentially a full leasing offer for charging infrastructure. So that means that you prepare the site for the charging station, we install it, we operate it for 3 or 5 years, depending what the preferred time is. We provide the full SLA, all repairs, and after the end of those 3 or 5 years, we come and take the charging station away. That's a full OpEx model that we can offer. And it really depends what type of business are you operating, how do you want to account for this charging investment. And as I said, you have those 3 options: outright purchase, financing, or a leasing ChargePoint as a service model.
Okay. Some other questions. How fast can an at-home charging station be installed? Thinking of, for example, new hires that really need their installation quickly and fast and as seamlessly as possible.
Yeah, I can. Oh, go ahead, Andre.
No, you take that.
Yeah, I think there's 2 ways to look at this. The one is how quickly can it be done if you order today, and generally we shoot for about 6 weeks as the maximum that we want to wait for that. But I mean, it's more interesting to match that installation to when the vehicle that's going to be charged there is actually going to be delivered. So we work with our fleet managers very closely on. We have these vehicles coming in March. So we plan those installations in January, February, for example. So it's really about optimizing, having that investment there, that infrastructure there, just in time for the vehicle that's going to be charged.
Do you have experience figures available on driver behavior with regards to home office charging and in public environment from Ham Lemkes? For example, figures related to kilowatt hour and costs, etc., based on experience of customers and drivers. Apparently, Ham Lemkes, and I can imagine he will not be the only one, that is interesting to have some guidance and best practice.
Yeah, I can take that one. So the answer to that is yes. Of course, I would say, because we monitor all the stations and all the drivers, so we have that data, and of course we cannot use that data other than anonymized and looking at analysis. So I have to be very clear about GDPR compliancy and data protection and what have you, which we are all compliant with, and very much so. But if you look then at anonymized data and what is the general behavior, as I previously stated, it is indeed in almost all countries you see, if you have bigger fleets, if you look at the larger numbers, about 40% of all charges are taking place at home. About 40% of all charges are taking place at workplace or depot, and about 20% in public. And that's general public, so that may be in the street as well as at fast chargers. The interesting bit there is that with that, the 40% of home is actually overrepresented, because not everybody can, Stephen just mentioned it, not everybody can have a home start. They don't have their own driveway and therewith the ability to home charge. So there is this interesting bit that actually home charging is overrepresented. Okay. So that's in percentages. If you look at kilowatt hours, you don't actually even have to look at kilowatt hours. So in general, we see a very consistent storyline with other reports which have been looking into average mileage per day. And if you look at the average mileage per day, it depends a little bit per country, but it is somewhere between 25 Netherlands to 60, I think it is in Germany. So there is a difference, but let's take the highest in Germany, around 60 per day. It's 5 kilometers to the kilowatt hour. So that's, if you do 60 kilometers, you do 12 kilowatt hours that you have to charge. 12 kilowatt hours, even if you have a single phase 16 amp 3.7 kilowatt charger, which is absolute, the lowest, slowest that you can find, then still in less than 3.5 hours, you're completely full with a dwell time, which is, well, how long is your car at home? Let's say generally 12 hours a day. You know, all of that adds up to simply no problem wherever you go, wherever you are.
Okay. Again, a question from Mats Johansson. Does ChargePoint support Ocpp 201 today? And if not, when will it happen?
So the answer to that is yes and no. So that's a very commercial answer. I will give you the details. So at the software side, so at the back office side, the answer to that is yes, we do. At the hardware side, we will introduce 2.0 as of January next year, literally January next year. So we could have done that still in this year, we don't. So on the hardware, we introduce it on January next year. So in 5.5 weeks' time.
Okay. I think a final question, Ola Axenborg. When it comes to DC charging when long distance traveling, what about the presentation inside the car for the driver? Availability, actual geo-position, charge capacity, how is it presented, depending on car brands?
Shall I take that, Fred, or do you take that from my hands? This is a Fred one, I will tell you.
No, I'd love to answer that, and
Yeah,
I'm laughing because I worked in an automotive manufacturer in my previous life. So it's a really good question, Ola. Thank you for that. And there's two ways that you can do that. The first is by interfacing directly with the navigation system, so the software backend of that respective car manufacturer. That's something that ChargePoint does. For example, with Mercedes-Benz in the United States. We power that system with charging station location, with availability information, so that driver, by fully integrated and having it into the navigation system, can plan their stops and their charging stops if they're traveling beyond their battery's range. The second part is about leveraging these things, what we carry with us all the time. So whether it be via Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, the ChargePoint app is fully integrated in there and can be projected into the car's navigation system. That's convenient because it allows you to, for example, start a charging session directly from the vehicle's display. It allows you to plan your routes. And as you're asking, it gives you the actual geo position and, of course, the availability of the charging stations there. So we see uptake in both of those areas. And it's really just about giving the driver, if they're in a public charging use case, that transparency to see charging stations around them.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Frederick. Thank you to Andre of ChargePoint. Thank you very much for answering the questions of our participants. It was a great webinar, and I think that both Andre and Frederick have guided us through the essential considerations for truly integrated and future-proof charging. Thank you once again. There will be a recorded version of this webinar that we will share also on our Fleet Europe website later on, so you can relive the webinar again. And of course, I would like to meet again with you for another webinar and another initiative of Fleet Europe. Thank you very much and have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.